The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as 600 Marines assembled in perfect formation on the parade ground. The air buzzed with nervous energy, though none of the assembled troops knew exactly why they had been called to attention at such short notice. Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez stood among her fellow SEALs in the front row, her posture rigid and professional despite the knot forming in her stomach. Admiral James Harrison strode onto the platform with the confidence of a man who had spent 35 years commanding respect through fear and intimidation. His silver hair gleamed in the California sunshine, and his chest bore ribbons that spoke of a distinguished career built on unwavering discipline and absolute authority. Behind him walked a small entourage of senior officers, their faces grim and purposeful. Maya had been dreading this moment for 3 weeks, ever since she had filed her formal complaint through the proper channels. She had hoped it would be handled quietly, professionally, behind closed doors where military matters belonged. Instead, Admiral Harrison had chosen to make a public spectacle of what should have been a private disciplinary hearing. The crowd fell silent as Harrison approached the microphone. His steel-gray eyes swept across the assembled troops before settling on Maya with unmistakable malice. She felt every pair of eyes in the formation turning toward her, and her heart pounded against her ribs like a caged bird. Marines, Harrison's voice boomed across the parade ground, amplified by speakers that carried his words to the farthest corners of the base. We are gathered here today to address a matter of grave concern to the integrity of our military justice system. Maya's commanding officer, Commander Sarah Chun, stood 20 feet away, her jaw clenched tight. Chun had tried everything within her power to prevent this public humiliation, but Harrison outranked them all. The Admiral had made it clear that this confrontation would serve as an example to anyone who dared challenge the established order. One of our number, Harrison continued, his voice dripping with disdain, has seen fit to file a complaint against a decorated officer based on nothing more than hearsay and emotional hysteria. This individual has chosen to undermine the chain of command and question the judgment of their superiors. The word hysteria hit Maya like a physical blow. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, completed the most grueling training the military had to offer, and earned her SEAL trident through blood, sweat, and determination that few could match. Yet here she stood, being dismissed as an emotional woman who couldn't handle the realities of military life. Behind her, Maya heard the subtle shift of boots on concrete as her fellow SEALs adjusted their positions. She knew they supported her, even if they couldn't show it openly in this moment. Team leader Marcus Johnson had been with her when they discovered the evidence that led to her complaint. Petty Officer David Kim had helped her document every detail with meticulous care. They all knew the truth, but speaking out now would only make things worse. The complaint had started 3 months earlier during a joint training exercise in Nevada. Maya and her team had been assigned to provide support for a multi-unit operation overseen by Colonel Rebecca Thompson, one of the most respected female officers in the Marines. Thompson had a reputation for excellence that had earned her rapid promotion through the ranks and the respect of everyone who served under her. It was supposed to be a routine training mission, but Maya had noticed irregularities in the after-action reports. Equipment that should have been accounted for was missing, and the timeline of events didn't match what she had witnessed firsthand. When she brought her concerns to Thompson privately, the colonel had thanked her and promised to investigate. 2 weeks later, Thompson was dead. The official report claimed she had died in a training accident during a night exercise, but Maya knew better. She had been assigned to the same exercise and had seen Thompson speaking with Admiral Harrison just hours before the alleged accident. The conversation had been heated, with Thompson waving documents that looked suspiciously like the missing equipment reports. Maya's investigation had been careful and thorough. She had spoken quietly with other personnel who had been present that night, gathered witness statements, and documented discrepancies in the official timeline. The picture that emerged was one of corruption and cover-up that reached the highest levels of command. Colonel Thompson had discovered that Admiral Harrison was involved in the systematic theft and resale of military equipment worth millions of dollars. When she had confronted him with evidence, he had silenced her permanently. The training accident had been carefully staged to look accidental, but Maya had found inconsistencies that painted a very different picture. Filing the complaint had been the hardest decision of Maya's career. She knew it would make her a target, but she also knew that Thompson deserved justice. The colonel had been a mentor to countless young officers and a trailblazer for women in combat roles. Her death couldn't be allowed to stand as just another training accident. Now, standing before 600 of her peers while Harrison painted her as an unstable troublemaker, Maya wondered if she had made the right choice. The Admiral's words were carefully chosen to destroy her credibility without directly addressing the substance of her allegations. This individual, Harrison continued, deliberately avoiding using Maya's name, has demonstrated a pattern of insubordination
This mission
and
is
disregard
critical.
for military protocol.
We cannot afford
Their
any
accusations
mistakes.
are based on speculation and innuendo rather than facts. They have chosen to pursue a personal vendetta that threatens to damage the reputation of a decorated officer who has served this country with distinction for over 3 decades. Maya felt the weight of 600 stares bearing down on her. Some of the faces in the crowd showed sympathy, others confusion, and a few displayed open hostility. She knew that Harrison's words were being carefully recorded and that this confrontation would follow her for the rest of her career, regardless of the eventual outcome. Commander Chin stepped forward slightly, her body language making it clear that she was prepared to intervene if necessary. Chin had served alongside Maya for 2 years and had seen firsthand the dedication and integrity that defined her character. She knew that Maya wouldn't have filed such a serious complaint without overwhelming evidence to support it. The crowd began to murmur as Harrison paused for dramatic effect. He was enjoying this moment, reveling in the power he held over Maya's future. To him, she represented everything that was wrong with the modern military. Women overstepping their bounds, junior officers questioning their superiors, and the erosion of traditional military hierarchy. Furthermore, Harrison's voice rose to silence the murmurs. This individual has chosen to waste valuable military resources pursuing these baseless allegations. Time and personnel that should be devoted to protecting our nation have instead been diverted to investigate the fantasies of someone who clearly lacks the emotional stability required for military service. Maya's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she maintained her military bearing. Every instinct screamed at her to speak up, to defend herself against these character assassinations. But she knew that any outburst would only confirm Harrison's portrayal of her as unstable and emotional. Behind the Admiral, Maya could see several officers shifting uncomfortably. She recognized Colonel Michael Foster, who had served under Thompson, and knew her reputation for integrity. His face was carefully neutral, but Maya could see doubt in his eyes as he listened to Harrison's words. Thompson had been respected throughout the command structure, and her sudden death had raised questions that many were afraid to voice openly. The investigation into Maya's complaint had been perfunctory at best. The officers assigned to review her evidence had been handpicked by Harrison and had dismissed key pieces of evidence as irrelevant or inconclusive. Witness statements that supported Maya's timeline had been excluded from the official report, while testimony that contradicted her claims had been given prominence. Maya had tried to appeal the decision through proper channels, but every avenue had led back to officers who owed their careers to Admiral Harrison's patronage. The military justice system that was supposed to protect whistleblowers and ensure accountability had instead become a weapon used to silence anyone who threatened the status quo. The sun was climbing higher now, and the heat was beginning to affect the assembled troops. Maya could see sweat beading on the foreheads of Marines in the back rows, but no one dared to move or show any sign of discomfort. This was military theater at its most brutal, designed to break down individual resistance and reinforce collective compliance. I want to be absolutely clear, Harrison's voice carried a note of finality, that this organization will not tolerate false accusations against its leadership. We have systems in place to address legitimate grievances, but those systems cannot function when they are abused by individuals seeking personal attention or pursuing personal vendettas. Maya felt her resolve wavering under the sustained assault on her character and motivations. She had entered the military to serve her country and protect the innocent, but now she was being portrayed as someone who would undermine that very mission for personal gain. The irony was bitter. She was being destroyed by the very corruption she had tried to expose. In the crowd, Maya spotted several faces that belonged to Marines who had served under Colonel Thompson. Their expressions were carefully controlled, but she could see the conflict in their eyes. They knew Thompson's character as well as Maya did, and they understood the significance of her death. Yet they also knew the cost of speaking out against a superior officer, especially one as powerful and vindictive as Admiral Harrison. The Admiral's next words would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. Harrison had spent weeks planning this confrontation, believing that public humiliation would finally silence Maya Rodriguez and send a clear message to anyone else who might consider challenging his authority. He had no idea that his own words were about to provide the evidence that would bring down his entire network of corruption and cover-up. As Maya stood there, enduring the calculated destruction of her reputation and career, she made a silent promise to Colonel Rebecca Thompson. This wasn't over. Harrison might have the power and influence to orchestrate this public spectacle, but he had also made a critical mistake. By bringing this confrontation into the open, he had created a record that couldn't be buried or ignored. The truth had a way of surfacing, even when powerful people tried to suppress it. Maya had learned that lesson in the mountains of Afghanistan, where reality had a way of cutting through official reports and sanitized briefings. She would wait, she would endure, and she would find a way to ensure that Thompson's death wasn't in vain. The Admiral raised his voice for his final assault, unaware that his next words would seal his fate and vindicate everything Maya had risked her career to expose. The confrontation was reaching its climax, but the real battle was just beginning. Admiral Harrison stepped closer to the microphone, his voice taking on a more personal and venomous tone. The morning heat was intensifying, but his fury seemed to radiate an even more oppressive warmth across the parade ground. 600 Marines stood motionless, many beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in military protocol. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Harrison finally spoke Maya's name, each syllable dripping with contempt, stepped forward. Maya's legs felt like lead as she took 3 measured steps forward, breaking from her formation. The distance between her and the Admiral seemed both infinite and suffocatingly small. Every eye on the parade ground was now fixed on her, and she could hear the subtle sound of cell phone cameras being activated despite strict prohibitions against recording military proceedings. "You have chosen to waste this organization's time and resources," Harrison continued, his voice amplifying across the base, "pursuing allegations that have no basis in fact. You have dishonored the memory of a fallen officer by using her death to advance your own agenda. And you have demonstrated that you lack the judgment and stability required for the responsibilities you have been given." Maya's jaw clenched, but she maintained her military bearing. Behind Harrison, she could see several senior officers exchanging glances. Colonel Foster looked particularly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Maya and the Admiral. Foster had been one of Thompson's closest allies and had worked with her on several high-profile missions. The suggestion that anyone would use Thompson's death for personal gain was not only offensive, but completely contrary to everything he knew about the deceased colonel's character and influence. "Your commanding officers have tried to counsel you." Harrison's voice rose to a near shout, "but you have refused to accept their guidance. You have persisted in spreading rumors and conspiracy theories that damage the morale and effectiveness of this unit. Today, that ends." Commander Chun took a half-step forward, her body language telegraphing her intention to intervene if Harrison went too far. She had read Maya's complaint file thoroughly and had been disturbed by several elements that didn't add up. The timeline inconsistencies Maya had identified were real, and the witness "You have chosen to circumvent the chain of command and pursue allegations against a superior officer without proper authorization or oversight." This was where Harrison made his first critical error. Maya had actually followed proper protocol to the letter, filing her initial complaint through her immediate superior and escalating it only when those channels proved inadequate. The Admiral's claim that she had circumvented the chain of command was not only false, but easily disproven by the paper trail she had meticulously maintained. In the crowd, several junior officers who were familiar with military protocol began to frown. Sergeant First Class Jennifer Walsh, who had helped Maya navigate the complaint process, shifted slightly in her position. Walsh knew that Maya had been almost obsessive about following proper procedures, precisely to avoid the kind of accusations Harrison was now making. "You have shown," Harrison's voice reached a crescendo, "that you are willing to sacrifice unit cohesion and military readiness to pursue personal vendettas. This is not the behavior we expect from someone entrusted with the responsibilities of a Navy SEAL. Maya felt something crack inside her chest, but it wasn't her resolve breaking. It was her fear finally giving way to controlled anger. Harrison was now attacking not just her character, but her professional competence and the achievement that had cost her more than he could ever understand. Earning her SEAL trident had required her to push beyond every physical and mental limit she possessed. The suggestion that she was unworthy of that accomplishment was a bridge too far. Your allegations, Harrison continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension in his audience, are based on nothing more than speculation and circumstantial evidence. The Admiral's dismissive characterization of her evidence would prove to be a significant vulnerability when the case eventually reached higher authorities. Behind Harrison, Admiral Patricia Williams had joined the group of senior officers on the platform. Williams was the highest-ranking female officer on the base and had a reputation for fairness and integrity that rivaled Thompson's. Her presence at this proceeding was unusual, and her expression suggested she was not entirely comfortable with what she was witnessing. Colonel Thompson, Harrison's voice suddenly softened with false reverence, was a dedicated officer who died serving her country. To suggest that her death was anything other than a tragic training accident is not only wrong, but deeply disrespectful to her memory and her family. Maya's hands trembled with suppressed rage. She had known Rebecca Thompson personally and had served under her command twice. Thompson had been a mentor, a role model, and someone who had shown Maya that it was possible to maintain both strength and compassion in military leadership. The idea that seeking justice for Thompson's death was somehow disrespectful was perhaps the most offensive thing Harrison had said yet. In the audience, Major Robert Santos was recording every word on his phone despite the prohibition against such recordings. Santos had been Thompson's deputy during her last assignment and had noted several irregularities in the investigation of her death. Harrison's public dismissal of legitimate questions about Thompson's death was creating evidence that could be used in future proceedings. What we have here, Harrison gestured dramatically toward Maya, is a classic example of someone who cannot accept the realities of military life. Someone who sees conspiracies where none exist, and who is willing to damage the reputation of dedicated officers to satisfy their own emotional needs. The crowd was beginning to murmur more audibly now. Harrison's characterization of Maya was so at odds with her reputation among the troops that many were beginning to question the Admiral's motives. Maya was known throughout the base as one of the most level-headed and professional SEALs in the unit. The suggestion that she was emotionally unstable struck many who knew her as absurd. "I have reviewed the evidence personally," Harrison declared, making his third critical error, "and I can state unequivocally that there is no substance to these allegations. The investigation was thorough and professional, and its conclusions are final." This statement would later prove to be Harrison's downfall. By claiming personal involvement in reviewing evidence that he had actually ordered to be suppressed, he was creating a documented lie that could be easily exposed. Several officers who had been involved in the investigation knew that key pieces of evidence had been excluded from the review, and Harrison's claim of thoroughness was demonstrably false. Commander Chun could no longer remain silent. She stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried across the parade ground despite not having access to the microphone. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has served with distinction and has followed proper protocol throughout this process." Harrison wheeled around to face Chun, his face flushed with anger. "Commander, you will step back and maintain proper military bearing. This proceeding does not require your input." Chun held her ground, her voice steady and clear. "Sir, with respect, I believe there are factual inaccuracies in your characterization that should be addressed." The tension on the platform was now palpable. Several senior officers were exchanging looks that suggested they were becoming uncomfortable with Harrison's handling of the situation. Admiral Williams stepped forward slightly, her body language indicating she might intervene if the confrontation escalated further. Harrison's face was now deep red with fury. He had planned this as a carefully orchestrated humiliation that would destroy Maya's credibility and career. Chen's intervention was threatening to turn it into a debate about facts and procedures, which was the last thing he wanted. "Commander Chun," Harrison's voice was dangerously quiet, "you are out of line. Return to your position immediately or face disciplinary action yourself." Chun hesitated for a moment, weighing the cost of further defiance against her duty to protect her subordinate. In that moment of hesitation, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground without amplification. "Sir, I request permission to respond to the allegations you have made." The parade ground fell completely silent. In 35 years of military service, Harrison had never had a subordinate make such a request during a disciplinary proceeding. The breach of protocol was stunning, but it was also within Maya's rights according to military justice regulations. Harrison stared at Maya with pure hatred. He had not expected her to fight back, and her request had caught him completely off guard. If he granted her permission to speak, she might say something that would complicate his carefully constructed narrative. If he refused, it would look like he was afraid to let her defend herself. Denied, Harrison snapped. "You will remain silent and accept the consequences of your actions." This was Harrison's fourth and most serious error. By refusing to allow Maya to respond to his accusations, he was violating basic principles of military justice that required accused personnel to have an opportunity to defend themselves. Several officers on the platform immediately recognized the legal implications of Harrison's refusal. Admiral Williams stepped forward decisively. "Admiral Harrison, I believe military protocol requires that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez be given an opportunity to respond to the allegations presented." Harrison turned to face Williams, his authority being challenged by someone of equal rank. "Admiral Williams, this is not a court-martial. It is a disciplinary proceeding, and I will conduct it as I see fit." Williams' response was calm, but firm. "Sir, regardless of the nature of the proceeding, military justice requires basic fairness. The staff sergeant has requested permission to speak, and that request should be granted." The confrontation between the two admirals created a moment of suspended tension. Everyone on the parade ground understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Williams was effectively challenging Harrison's authority in front of 600 witnesses, and the outcome would have implications far beyond Maya's individual case. Harrison realized he was trapped. If he continued to refuse Maya permission to speak, it would appear that he was afraid of what she might say. If he granted permission, she might say something that would damage his position. Either choice carried significant risks. In the crowd, several officers were now openly recording the proceedings despite the prohibition. They understood that they were witnessing something that would likely have historical significance, and they wanted to preserve a record of exactly what was said and done. Maya stood perfectly still, waiting for Harrison's decision. She knew that her request had created a critical moment, and she was prepared for either outcome. If she was allowed to speak, she would present her case with the same precision and professionalism that had defined her military career. If she was silenced, that silence would itself become evidence of the corruption she was trying to expose. Harrison looked out over the assembled troops, seeing expressions that ranged from confusion to open skepticism. His attempt to destroy Maya's credibility was backfiring, and he was beginning to realize that his public confrontation had been a serious miscalculation. The Admiral's next words would determine whether this confrontation ended with Maya's career in ruins or with the beginning of his own downfall. The 600 Marines waited in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing a defining moment in military justice. Admiral Harrison's jaw worked silently as he stared at Maya, his mind racing through the implications of his options. The silence stretched across the parade ground like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Behind him, Admiral Williams maintained her position, her presence a constant reminder that his authority was being questioned by a peer. "Very well," Harrison finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you have 2 minutes to respond. Choose your words carefully." Maya stepped forward another pace, positioning herself where her voice would carry clearly across the assembled troops. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this possibility, knowing that if she ever got the chance to speak, she would have only one opportunity to present her case. "Thank you, sir," Maya began, her voice steady and professional. "I want to address the characterization of my complaint and the evidence that supports it." She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a folded document, holding it up where everyone could see it. "This is a copy of the equipment manifest from the Nevada training exercise where Colonel Thompson died. It shows 18 pieces of sensitive communications equipment that were signed out under Colonel Thompson's authorization, but never returned to inventory. Harrison's face went pale. He had assumed that all copies of the problematic manifests had been confiscated during the investigation. The fact that Maya still possessed documentary evidence was a development he had not anticipated. Furthermore, Maya continued, unfolding the document. This manifest bears timestamps that directly contradict the official timeline presented in Colonel Thompson's death investigation. According to this document, she was still signing out equipment at 2,147 hours on the night she allegedly died in a training accident at 2,130 hours. A murmur ran through the assembled troops. Even those without detailed knowledge of the case could understand the significance of the timing discrepancy Maya had identified. Admiral Williams leaned forward slightly, her expression showing intense interest in the details being presented. Harrison made a move toward the microphone, but Williams placed a restraining hand on his arm. Let her finish, Admiral. She's addressing the substance of the allegations. Maya saw the exchange between the two senior officers and understood that she had gained a temporary ally in Admiral Williams. She pressed forward with her presentation, knowing that every second was precious. I have witness statements from 4 personnel who saw Colonel Thompson alive and working in the communications bunker after the time she allegedly died, Maya continued. These statements were submitted as part of my original complaint, but were excluded from the official investigation report. She held up another set of documents, fanned out so they were clearly visible. I also have photographs taken at the alleged accident site that show tire tracks inconsistent with the vehicle Colonel Thompson was supposedly driving. These photographs were taken by Marine photographer Corporal James Liu as part of standard accident documentation, but they were also excluded from the final report. Colonel Foster stepped forward from the group of senior officers, his expression showing deep concern. As someone who had worked closely with Thompson, he was keenly interested in any evidence that might shed light on her death. Staff Sergeant, are you alleging that evidence was deliberately suppressed? Harrison spun around to face Foster. Colonel, you will not engage with this fantasy. Return to your position. But Foster held his ground, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had served with distinction for 23 years. Sir, if there are factual discrepancies in the investigation of Colonel Thompson's death, they need to be addressed. She was a respected colleague and deserves a thorough investigation. Maya seized the moment to present her most damaging evidence. Colonel Foster, the suppression of evidence is documented. I have email records showing that Admiral Harrison personally ordered the exclusion of witness statements and physical evidence from the investigation file. She held up a final document, this one clearly showing the official letterhead of the base commander's office. This directive, signed by Admiral Harrison, specifically instructs the investigating team to disregard any evidence that does not support the conclusion that Colonel Thompson's death was accidental. The crowd erupted in barely suppressed conversation. The implications of Maya's statement were staggering. If accurate, they suggested not only a cover-up but active interference in a military death investigation by the highest-ranking officer on the base. Harrison's face was now purple with rage. That document is classified material. You have no authority to possess it, and displaying it publicly is a violation of security protocols. Maya's response was calm and measured. Sir, this document was provided to me through proper whistleblower channels when my initial complaint was filed. It is part of the official record of this case, and is not classified above my security clearance level. Admiral Williams stepped forward decisively. Admiral Harrison, I need to review that document immediately. If it contains the allegations Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has described, it raises serious questions about the conduct of this investigation. Harrison found himself trapped between multiple pressures. Williams was demanding to review evidence that would expose his interference in the investigation. Maya had presented documentation that contradicted his public statements, and the crowd of 600 Marines was witnessing evidence of potential corruption at the highest levels of their command structure. This proceeding is over, Harrison declared, moving toward the microphone to end the confrontation. All personnel will return to their assigned duties immediately. But Maya wasn't finished. She raised her voice to carry across the parade ground without amplification. Admiral Harrison, why did you meet privately with Colonel Thompson on the night she died? And why were you carrying equipment manifests when you left that meeting? The question hit Harrison like a physical blow. No one was supposed to know about his final meeting with Thompson, and the fact that Maya could place him at the scene with the incriminating documents suggested her investigation had been far more thorough than he had realized. I have witness statements from 2 Marines who saw you leaving the communications bunker at 2,205 hours, Maya continued, pressing her advantage. That was 35 minutes after Colonel Thompson was supposedly already dead in a training accident 15 miles away. The mathematical impossibility of Harrison's presence at both locations was clear to everyone present. The Admiral's carefully constructed timeline was collapsing under the weight of Maya's evidence, and his public denials were now clearly contradicted by documented facts. Commander Chin stepped forward to stand beside Maya, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. Sir, these allegations raise serious questions about the integrity of our investigation processes. I formally request that this matter be referred to the Inspector General for independent review. Admiral Williams nodded gravely. Commander Chin's request is appropriate given the evidence presented. Admiral Harrison, I am invoking my authority as senior officer present to suspend this proceeding pending a comprehensive review of these allegations. Harrison's career flashed before his eyes as he realized the full scope of his exposure. Maya's evidence was not only damaging but appeared to be meticulously documented and supported by multiple witnesses. His attempt to destroy her credibility had instead provided her with a platform to present evidence that could destroy him. This is inappropriate, Harrison protested weakly. These allegations have already been investigated and found to be without merit. Maya seized the opportunity to deliver her final blow. Sir, if the investigation was thorough and professional as you claimed, why did it conclude that Colonel Thompson died at 2,130 hours when her own communications equipment was actively transmitting data until 2247 hours that night? She held up a final document, this one bearing the official seal of the Base Communications Office. This transmission log shows that Colonel Thompson's personal radio was sending encrypted data for over an hour after her supposed death. The data was being transmitted to an off-base location that matches the address of a storage facility where stolen military equipment has been recovered by civilian law enforcement. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Maya was not only alleging that Thompson's death had been covered up, but that it was connected to a larger conspiracy involving the theft and sale of military equipment. The transmission data provided a direct link between Thompson, the missing equipment, and Harrison's attempts to silence the investigation. Colonel Foster stepped forward again, his voice carrying the weight of his years of service. Admiral Harrison, these allegations are extremely serious. The evidence presented requires immediate investigation by appropriate authorities outside the local chain of command. Admiral Williams was already reaching for her phone. I'm contacting the Inspector General's office and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. This matter is now beyond our local authority to handle. Harrison realized that his position was completely compromised. Maya's evidence was not only substantial, but had been presented in front of 600 witnesses. Any attempt to suppress or discredit it would now be impossible, and his public statements during this confrontation had created a record that could be used against him in any future proceedings. Guards, Harrison called out desperately. Arrest Staff Sergeant Rodriguez for unauthorized disclosure of classified material. But Admiral Williams countermanded the order immediately. Belay that order. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is under my protection pending the arrival of NCIS investigators. Maya stood surrounded by her fellow SEALs, who had moved to form a protective formation around her. Commander Chin remained at her side, while Colonel Foster and several other senior officers positioned themselves between Maya and any personnel who might attempt to carry out Harrison's order. The confrontation had reached its climax, but the resolution was no longer in doubt. Harrison's attempt to destroy Maya's career and credibility had instead exposed his own corruption and potentially criminal conduct. The evidence she had presented was too substantial and well-documented to be dismissed or ignored. As NCIS vehicles began arriving at the base perimeter, Harrison realized that his 35-year career was effectively over. The corruption network he had built and protected was about to be exposed, and the woman he had tried to destroy would be vindicated by the very evidence he had attempted to suppress. Maya Rodriguez had confronted one of the most powerful officers in the military and emerged victorious. But as she watched Harrison's world beginning to collapse around him, she took no satisfaction in his downfall. Her only thought was of Colonel Rebecca Thompson, whose death would finally receive the investigation and justice it deserved. The real battle was just beginning, but the tide had turned decisively. Truth had a way of surfacing, even when buried under the weight of institutional power and corruption. Maya had proven that courage and integrity could triumph over fear and intimidation, but the cost of that victory was yet to be fully counted. The NCIS vehicles rolled through the main gate of Camp Pendleton with an urgency that sent ripples of tension throughout the base. Within minutes, Special Agent Sarah Mitchell and her team were setting up a command center in the base conference room, their equipment and authority transforming the familiar military environment into something resembling a crime scene. Maya Rodriguez sat in a holding room, no longer under suspicion, but rather under protective custody, while investigators worked to unravel the corruption network she had exposed. Through the window, she could see Admiral Harrison being escorted to a separate building, his hands secure behind his back, and his face bearing the hollow expression of someone whose world had collapsed in a matter of hours. Special Agent Mitchell was a 20-year veteran of military criminal investigations, and she had seen enough corruption cases to recognize the hallmarks of a sophisticated cover-up. As she reviewed the evidence Maya had presented during the confrontation, she realized they were dealing with something far more extensive than a single officer's misconduct. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Mitchell began as she entered Maya's room. I want you to know that your evidence has triggered a full investigation that extends far beyond this base. The transmission logs you provided have led us to 3 off-base storage facilities, and what we found there suggests a criminal enterprise that has been operating for several years. Maya felt a mixture of vindication and sadness as she absorbed the implications. Agent Mitchell, how many people were involved? How long has this been going on? Mitchell consulted her notes before responding. We're still determining the full scope, but initial evidence suggests at least 12 officers across 4 military installations were involved in systematically stealing and reselling military equipment. The operation was sophisticated enough to have generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow. She had known that Harrison was corrupt, but the scale of the criminal enterprise was beyond anything she had imagined. Colonel Thompson discovered this entire network, didn't she? Based on the evidence we've recovered from her personal files, Mitchell confirmed, Colonel Thompson had identified the entire operation and was preparing to expose it when she was killed. The documents in her possession would have brought down the entire network and potentially led to court-martial proceedings against more than a dozen senior officers. Maya closed her eyes, finally understanding the full magnitude of what Rebecca Thompson had died trying to expose. Thompson hadn't just discovered Harrison's involvement in equipment theft. She had uncovered a conspiracy that reached across multiple bases and involved some of the most senior officers in the military. The transmission data from her radio on the night she died, Mitchell continued, was being sent to a secure server where she had stored backup copies of all her evidence. Harrison didn't know about the server, which is why he thought killing her would end the investigation. Your complaint gave us the legal authority to access that server and recover everything Thompson had collected. In another building across the base, Admiral Harrison sat across from federal prosecutors who were laying out the charges against him. Murder, conspiracy, theft of government property, obstruction of justice, and violation of his oath of office were just the beginning. The evidence Maya had presented during the public confrontation, combined with Thompson's hidden files, painted a picture of corruption that shocked even experienced criminal investigators. Admiral, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chun addressed Harrison with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed contempt. We have recorded communications showing that you personally ordered the execution of Colonel Thompson when she refused to abandon her investigation. You're looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. Harrison's lawyer, a military defense attorney who had been hastily assigned to the case, looked pale as he reviewed the evidence. The recorded phone calls, financial records, and witness statements created an airtight case that would be almost impossible to defend. His client's best hope was to cooperate with investigators and hope for a plea agreement that might spare him from the death penalty. My client is prepared to provide information about other participants in this conspiracy, the lawyer said carefully, in exchange for consideration in sentencing. Chin leaned back in his chair, studying Harrison with the cold assessment of someone who prosecuted corrupt officials for a living. Your client orchestrated the murder of a decorated Marine officer who was doing her duty to expose corruption. The only consideration he's going to receive is our promise not to seek the death penalty if he provides complete cooperation and accepts responsibility for his actions. Meanwhile, Admiral Williams was holding an emergency briefing for the senior staff that had witnessed the confrontation. The implications of Maya's revelations were still being processed, but it was clear that the entire command structure of the base would need to be reviewed and potentially reorganized. Ladies and gentlemen, Williams addressed the assembled officers, we are facing the most serious corruption scandal in the history of this installation. The evidence presented by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has exposed criminal conduct that reaches the highest levels of our command structure. Colonel Foster, who had been one of Thompson's closest colleagues, struggled to process the scope of the conspiracy. Admiral, how did this network operate for so long without being detected? How many of our investigations and operations were compromised? Williams consulted the preliminary NCIS report before responding. Agent Mitchell's team believes the conspiracy has been active for at least 5 years. During that time, equipment worth over $8 million was stolen and resold to private contractors and foreign buyers. The operation was sophisticated enough to alter inventory records, falsify training reports, and eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. Commander Chun, who had stood with Maya during the confrontation, raised a concern that was weighing heavily on everyone's mind. What about the Marines who were present during Admiral Harrison's accusations against Staff Sergeant Rodriguez? They witnessed him make statements that we now know were deliberately false and designed to destroy the reputation of someone who was trying to expose serious crimes. Williams nodded gravely. That's a significant concern. Admiral Harrison's public attack on Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was not only inappropriate, but appears to have been part of a deliberate strategy to discredit anyone who threatened the conspiracy. We're going to need to address this with the entire command and ensure that every Marine understands what really happened here. Back in the NCIS Command Center, Agent Mitchell was coordinating with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The storage facilities connected to Thompson's transmission data had yielded not only stolen military equipment, but also evidence of sales to international buyers who were not authorized to possess sensitive American technology. This isn't just theft, Mitchell explained to her team. We're looking at potential espionage charges. Some of this equipment ended up in the hands of foreign nationals who have connections to intelligence services hostile to the United States. The investigation was expanding rapidly as each piece of evidence led to new connections and previously unknown participants. Phone records, financial transactions, and shipping manifests painted a picture of an operation that had reached international scope and had potentially compromised national security. Maya was called back for additional questioning as investigators worked to understand the full timeline of her investigation. Agent Mitchell was particularly interested in how Maya had managed to gather such comprehensive evidence while operating under the constraints of military hierarchy and Harrison's active efforts to suppress her investigation. Staff Sergeant, Mitchell asked, how did you know to preserve copies of all this evidence outside official channels? Your documentation is more thorough than most professional investigations. Maya thought carefully before responding. Colonel Thompson taught me to always maintain independent records when dealing with sensitive situations. She said that people in positions of power sometimes made evidence disappear, and the only protection was to ensure that multiple copies existed in secure locations. The irony was bitter. Thompson's own advice had provided the tools that would eventually expose her killers and vindicate her death. Maya realized that Thompson had probably suspected she was in danger and had taken steps to ensure that her investigation would survive even if she didn't. The night she died, Maya continued, Colonel Thompson sent me an encrypted message telling me to remember what she had taught me about documentation. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but now I realize she was telling me to preserve everything independently. Mitchell made careful notes as Maya spoke. Thompson's final message suggested she had known she was in immediate danger and had tried to ensure that her evidence would be protected. The fact that she had chosen Maya as the person to preserve that evidence spoke to Thompson's trust in her character and judgment. As the day progressed, additional arrests were made across multiple military installations. The conspiracy Harrison had led involved officers at bases in California, Nevada, Texas, and North Carolina. Each arrest provided new evidence and expanded the investigation further. The media had gotten wind of the story, and news vans were beginning to gather outside the base perimeter. The public confrontation between Harrison and Maya, witnessed by 600 Marines, had been impossible to keep quiet. Cell phone video of key moments had already appeared on social media, despite military regulations prohibiting such recordings. Admiral Williams called Maya to her office as the sun began to set on what had been the most dramatic day in Camp Pendleton's recent history. Maya entered to find Williams standing at her window, looking out at the base where her career had taken such an unexpected turn. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Williams began without turning around, "I owe you an apology. This command failed you badly when you tried to report legitimate concerns through proper channels. The system that should have protected you instead tried to destroy you." Maya stood at attention, unsure how to respond to such an unprecedented admission from a senior officer. "Thank you, ma'am. I just wanted to see justice for Colonel Thompson." Williams finally turned to face Maya, her expression showing a mixture of respect and sadness. "You've accomplished more than justice, Staff Sergeant. You've exposed a cancer that was eating away at the integrity of our entire organization. But I suspect the cost to you personally has been enormous." Maya nodded slowly, thinking of the isolation and fear she had endured for months while pursuing her investigation. "Ma'am, Colonel Thompson died. Try to do the right thing. I couldn't let that sacrifice be meaningless." "It won't be," Williams assured her. "Agent Mitchell tells me that Thompson's evidence, combined with what you've provided, will likely result in the largest military corruption prosecution in decades. Every person involved in this conspiracy will face justice." As Maya left Admiral Williams' office, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice was finally being served, but the cost had been enormous. Good people had died, careers had been destroyed, and the trust between military personnel and their leadership would take years to rebuild. The investigation was far from over, and Maya knew she would be spending months providing testimony and helping investigators understand the full scope of the conspiracy. But for the first time since filing her initial complaint, she felt that the truth was finally coming to light. Colonel Rebecca Thompson's death would not be in vain. The corruption network that had killed her was being systematically dismantled, and the military justice system was finally working the way it was supposed to work. Maya had kept her promise to seek justice for her fallen mentor, and now it was time to help build something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. 6 months later, Maya Rodriguez stood before a different gathering of military personnel, but this time the atmosphere was one of solemn respect rather than hostile confrontation. The courtroom at the Naval Justice School was packed with officers, enlisted personnel, and family members who had come to witness the final chapter of the largest military corruption trial in modern history. Admiral James Harrison sat at the defendant's table, his once proud bearing replaced by the hunched posture of someone who had lost everything that had defined his identity. The 35 years of service that had been his legacy were now overshadowed by the crimes he had committed in pursuit of personal gain and power. Judge Admiral Catherine Morrison presided over the court-martial with the gravity befitting such a momentous case. The evidence presented over the past month had painted a picture of corruption that shocked even seasoned military justice professionals. Equipment theft, murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice were just the beginning of Harrison's crimes. Maya was called as the final prosecution witness, her testimony serving to tie together all the evidence that had been presented throughout the trial. As she took the oath and settled into the witness chair, she could see the faces of the 600 Marines who had witnessed Harrison's public attack on her character and credibility. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the military prosecutor, began, "Please tell the court about your relationship with Colonel Rebecca Thompson and what led you to investigate the circumstances of her death." Maya's voice was steady as she recounted the story that had brought them all to this moment. She spoke of Thompson's mentorship, her discovery of the equipment theft, and the conversation she had witnessed between Thompson and Harrison on the night of Thompson's death. "Colonel Thompson was more than a superior officer," Maya testified. "She was a role model who showed me that integrity and honor weren't just words in the military code. They were principles worth dying for. When she was killed for trying to expose corruption, I knew I had to continue her work regardless of the personal cost." The defense attorney, a seasoned military lawyer who had taken Harrison's case knowing it was unwinnable, made a perfunctory cross-examination that failed to shake any part of Maya's testimony. The evidence against Harrison was so overwhelming that the defense strategy had shifted to seeking life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. Harrison himself never took the stand. His cooperation with investigators had led to the arrest and conviction of 11 other officers across 4 military installations, but it had come too late to generate any sympathy from a court. The murder of Colonel Thompson had been too calculated and the cover-up too extensive for any mitigation to be meaningful. When the verdict was announced, there was no surprise in the courtroom. Guilty on all counts, including premeditated murder, conspiracy, theft of government property, and violation of his oath of office. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, bringing an end to a career that had once seemed destined for the highest levels of military leadership. Maya felt no satisfaction as Harrison was led away in shackles. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous for everyone involved. 12 officers had been court-martialed, hundreds of personnel had been investigated, and the reputation of the military justice system had been severely damaged by the revelation that corruption had flourished at the highest levels. After the trial, Maya was approached by Admiral Williams, who had traveled to attend the final proceedings. Williams had been promoted to head a new oversight committee designed to prevent future corruption scandals, and her first initiative had been to reform the whistleblower protection system that had failed Maya so badly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Williams said as they stood outside the courthouse, "I wanted you to know that your courage has led to fundamental changes in how we handle internal investigations. The system that failed you has been completely restructured to ensure that legitimate complaints receive proper investigation and protection." Maya nodded appreciatively, though she couldn't help but think of all the people who had suffered because those protections hadn't existed when they were needed. "Thank you, ma'am. I hope this means that no one else will have to go through what Colonel Thompson and I experienced." Williams' expression grew serious. "The changes we've made are significant, but they're only as effective as the people who implement them. We need officers like you in positions where you can help ensure that integrity remains the foundation of military service." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Rebecca Thompson's family. Her parents, James and Maria Thompson, had attended every day of the trial and had asked to meet Maya personally. Their daughter's death had been devastating, but learning the truth about her murder and seeing justice served had provided some measure of peace. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, James Thompson said, his voice heavy with emotion, "We can never thank you enough for what you've done. Rebecca would be so proud to know that her death led to the exposure of this corruption and that changes are being made to protect future whistleblowers." Maya struggled to maintain her composure as she faced the parents of the woman whose memory had driven her through months of investigation and testimony. "Sir, Colonel Thompson was an inspiration to everyone who served under her command. She died trying to do the right thing, and I just wanted to make sure that sacrifice wasn't meaningless." Maria Thompson embraced Maya with the warmth of someone whose grief had been transformed into gratitude. "Because of you, Rebecca's death saved countless lives and protected our military from corruption that could have compromised national security. She would be proud of the officer you've become." As the Thompson family departed, Maya was approached by several junior officers who had been following the case closely. They represented a new generation of military leaders who had been inspired by Maya's courage and determination to pursue justice despite overwhelming opposition. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a young Marine officer who had recently completed her basic training, spoke for the group. "Staff Sergeant, we wanted you to know that your example has shown us what it means to truly live by the military values we swore to uphold. You've proven that individual courage can overcome institutional corruption." Maya looked at the young faces surrounding her and felt a sense of hope that had been absent during the dark months of investigation and trial. These officers represented the future of the military, and their commitment to integrity suggested that the changes Admiral Williams had implemented would be sustained by people who understood their importance. "Lieutenant," Maya responded, "the most important thing I've learned is that our oath is to the Constitution and the American people, not to any individual officer or institution. When those values conflict with orders or pressure from superiors, we have to choose courage over convenience." The group of young officers dispersed with a sense of purpose that Maya found deeply encouraging. The military would recover from the scandal, but only if the next generation of leaders remained committed to the principles that Harrison and his conspirators had betrayed. As Maya walked away from the courthouse, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The confrontation with Admiral Harrison before 600 Marines had been the most terrifying experience of her military career, but it had also been the moment when truth triumphed over power and integrity prevailed over corruption. The phone call came that evening as Maya was preparing for what she hoped would be her first peaceful night's sleep in months. Admiral Williams was on the line with news that would change the trajectory of Maya's career once again. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Williams began, I have a proposition for you. The Pentagon is establishing a new office to investigate military corruption and protect whistleblowers. They need someone with your experience and integrity to help lead this initiative. The position would require promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment to Washington, D.C. Maya sat in stunned silence as she absorbed the implications of Williams' offer. The promotion would represent a significant advancement in her career, but more importantly, it would provide an opportunity to help prevent other officers from experiencing what she and Colonel Thompson had endured. Ma'am, Maya finally responded, I'm honored by the offer. What exactly would this position involve? Williams' voice carried excitement as she outlined the scope of the new office. You would be responsible for developing and implementing new procedures for investigating corruption allegations, training investigators in proper protocols, and serving as an advocate for personnel who report wrongdoing. Essentially, you would be building the system that should have existed when you tried to report Harrison's crimes. The opportunity to help create meaningful change was compelling, but Maya also knew that accepting the position would mean leaving her SEAL team and the operational role that had defined her military identity. The decision would require careful consideration of her long-term goals and the impact she wanted to have on military culture. Admiral, Maya said after a long pause, I need some time to consider this offer. It's a significant change from my current role, and I want to make sure I'm making the right decision. Williams' response was understanding and patient. Of course, Staff Sergeant. Take all the time you need. The position will be available when you're ready to make a decision. As Maya ended the call, she looked out at Camp Pendleton's lights stretching toward the Pacific Ocean. The base that had been the site of her greatest professional crisis was now offering her the opportunity to ensure that future military personnel would be protected when they chose courage over silence. Colonel Rebecca Thompson had died, trying to expose corruption and protect the integrity of military service. Maya had honored that sacrifice by pursuing justice despite overwhelming opposition. Now she had the chance to build lasting protections that would honor Thompson's memory and prevent future tragedies. The confrontation with Admiral Harrison had ended his career and vindicated Maya's courage, but the real victory would be measured in the changes that emerged from the scandal he had created. Maya Rodriguez had learned that individual courage could overcome institutional corruption, but lasting change required building better institutions that would protect future truth-tellers. As she prepared for bed, Maya made her decision. She would accept Admiral Williams' offer and dedicate herself to creating the systemic protections that could have saved Colonel Thompson's life. The best way to honor her mentor's memory was to ensure that no one else would die for trying to do the right thing. The confrontation that had nearly destroyed her career had instead launched her toward a new mission that would define the rest of her military service. Maya Rodriguez, the SEAL who had stood alone against corruption, would now help build the systems that would protect others who chose integrity over safety. The victory was complete, but the work was just beginning.